In the autumn chill of 1941, as the leaves turned brittle and the war in the East surged into its most brutal phase, a quiet transformation was taking place within the machinery of Nazi Germany, a shift from persecution to annihilation. It had begun years earlier, not with gunfire or gas, but with ink and law. In 1935, beneath the medieval arches of Nuremberg, the Nazi regime unveiled two statutes that would sever Jewish citizens from the body of the German nation: the Reich Citizenship Law and the Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honor. Overnight, Jews were stripped of citizenship, forbidden to marry non-Jews, banned from displaying the national flag, and excluded from public life. These were not spontaneous acts of hatred. They were the first calibrated strokes of a legal architecture designed to isolate, dehumanize, and ultimately erase an entire people from the map of Europe. The years that followed were a slow, methodical tightening of the noose. Boycotts of Jewish businesses in 1933 gave way to forced Aryanization of property by the late 1932. Synagogues burned during Kristallnacht in November 1938, while police stood by. Children were expelled from schools, professionals disbarred, passports stamped with a red J. Each measure was presented not as violence, but as order, as policy, as progress. And behind it all loomed the figure of Adolf Hitler, whose 1939 Reichstag speech had ominously warned that if international finance Jewry plunged the world into war, the result would be the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. At the time, many dismissed it as rhetoric. But as the war expanded, Poland invaded in 1939, France fallen in 1940, the Soviet Union attacked in June 1941, that threat began to take on terrifying substance. In occupied Poland, ghettos sprang up like open-air prisons. Warsaw, Łódź, Kraków overcrowded, starved, sealed off by walls and barbed wire. Disease and despair became daily companions. Yet even these ghettos were never meant to be permanent. They were holding pens, temporary solutions, in a regime increasingly impatient with its own incrementalism. Meanwhile, in the East, mobile killing units known as Einsatzgruppen followed the Wehrmacht across the Soviet frontier. By late 1941, they had already murdered hundreds of thousands men, women, children, shot into ravines, buried in mass graves near towns like Babi Yar outside Kyiv, where over 33,000 Jews were killed in 2 days alone. The scale of death was staggering, but the method was proving inefficient, psychologically taxing for the shooters, and logistically unsustainable for a continent-wide genocide. It was in this context, amid mounting chaos, competing fiefdoms within the Nazi bureaucracy, and a war that showed no sign of ending, that Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Reich Security Main Office and one of the most powerful men in the Third Reich, received orders from Hermann Göring. On the 31st of July 1941, Göring authorized Heydrich to make all necessary preparations for a total solution of the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence in Europe. The phrase, Gesamtlösung der Judenfrage, was deliberately vague, but its implications were clear. What had been a patchwork of regional atrocities now required central coordination. A conference was called. On the 20th of January 1942, 15 men gathered in a lakeside villa in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee. The house, elegant and serene, belonged to the SS and overlooked the frozen expanse of the Grosser Wannsee. Inside, over brandy and cigars, senior officials from the SS, the Gestapo, the Foreign Office, the Interior Ministry, and the Justice Department convened not to debate morality, but logistics. Heydrich, presiding with calm authority, laid out the plan. Approximately 11 million Jews across Europe, from the Channel Islands to the Caucasus, were to be evacuated to the east for appropriate treatment. The language was clinical, euphemistic. Evacuation meant deportation to death camps. Treatment meant murder. No one present objected. No one asked for clarification. They discussed railway timetables, definitions of who counted as Jewish, including the Mischlinge, those of mixed ancestry, and the legal status of Jews married to Germans. It was bureaucracy in service of genocide. What made Wannsee so chilling was not the presence of monsters, but of functionaries, men with law degrees, administrative experience, and polite manners. Adolf Eichmann, who took the minutes, later claimed he was merely following orders, yet his meticulous notes reveal a man deeply invested in the mechanics of destruction. The conference lasted just 90 minutes. By its end, the Holocaust was no longer a series of ad hoc massacres. It was a continent-wide industrial project, sanctioned at the highest levels, coordinated across ministries, and executed with chilling efficiency. In the months that followed, the machinery accelerated. 6 extermination camps were built or repurposed in occupied Poland: Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chełmno, and Majdanek. Unlike concentration camps, which imprisoned political enemies and forced laborers, these were designed for one purpose: mass murder. Victims arrived by train, often believing they were being resettled. They were told to undress for showers. Then came the gas, Zyklon B, at Auschwitz, carbon monoxide from engine exhaust at the others. Within hours of arrival, most were dead. Their hair was shorn for mattress stuffing, their gold teeth melted down, their ashes scattered in fields or dumped in rivers. The scale defies comprehension. By 1944, Auschwitz alone could murder 10,000 people a day. Entire communities vanished: Salonika's ancient Sephardic Jews, the shtetls of Lithuania, the vibrant centers of Warsaw and Vilnius. Yet resistance flickered, even in darkness. In the Warsaw Ghetto, fighters armed with pistols and Molotov cocktails held off the SS for nearly a month. In the spring of 1943, in Sobibor, prisoners staged a daring revolt, killing guards and escaping into the forests. And in Berlin, a handful of Jews survived in hiding, aided by courageous Germans who risked everything. People like Otto Veit, who employed blind and deaf Jews in his workshop, or the Scholls of Munich, whose white rose leaflets condemned the regime before they were executed. But for most, there was no rescue. The Allies knew through intercepted cables, refugee reports, aerial reconnaissance, but prioritized military victory over intervention. Bombing the rail lines to Auschwitz was deemed impractical. Opening borders to refugees was politically fraught. The world watched and largely looked away. As the Red Army advanced from the east in 1944 and 1945, the SS began dismantling the camps, forcing survivors on death marches through snow and ice. Thousands collapsed, were shot, or simply disappeared into the frozen earth. When Soviet troops liberated Auschwitz on the 27th of January 1945, they found fewer than 7,000 emaciated prisoners. Most had already been marched west. At Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, American and British soldiers encountered scenes that defied belief. Stacked corpses, skeletal survivors, warehouses filled with human hair, eyeglasses, children's shoes. The war in Europe ended on the 8th of May 1945. Hitler was dead, his bunker in ruins. Heydrich had been assassinated in Prague in 1942. Goering would swallow cyanide before his hanging at Nuremberg. Eichmann fled to Argentina, only to be captured by Israeli agents in 1960 and hanged in Jerusalem. Of the 15 men at Wannsee, only a few faced justice. Many returned to quiet lives as lawyers, civil servants, academics. And yet, the moral paradox remains. How could educated men, products of a cultured society, sit at a polished table and plan the extermination of millions with such bureaucratic detachment? The answer lies not in madness, but in the banality of evil, the slow erosion of empathy through ideology, the surrender of conscience to hierarchy, the belief that paperwork absolves one of blood. Wannsee was not an aberration. It was the logical endpoint of a decade of dehumanization, where laws replaced lynch mobs and genocide wore a suit and tie. Today, the villa at Am Großen Wannsee, 5658, stands as a memorial and museum. Sunlight filters through the same windows that once framed discussions of mass murder. Visitors walk the rooms where coffee was served after decisions that doomed millions. And in that silence, a question echoes not just about the past, but about the present. When systems of power devalue human life, when prejudice is codified into policy, when indifference becomes complicity, how far are we, really, from another Wannsee? The legacy of Wannsee did not end with the collapse of the Third Reich. It seeped into the foundations of the post-war world, shaping international law, human rights doctrine, and the very language we use to confront atrocity. In the courtroom at Nuremberg, prosecutors faced a dilemma: how to charge men who had broken no German law. The Nazi state had made genocide legal. To answer this, the Allies invented a new category of crime: crimes against humanity, a term that acknowledged that some acts are so heinous they violate the conscience of humankind itself, regardless of national statutes. The Wannsee Protocol, discovered by chance in 1,947 inches, the files of the German Foreign Office, became exhibit number 116 at the ministry's trial, one of the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings. There, it served as chilling proof that the Holocaust was not the work of rogue fanatics, but of a coordinated state apparatus operating with chilling rationality. Yet justice was partial. Of the 15 men who attended the conference, only 6 were ever tried. Some, like Wilhelm Stuckert, the Interior Ministry official who had argued for sterilizing first-degree Mischlinge instead of killing them, were sentenced to time already served and resumed careers in West Germany's new democracy. Others vanished into obscurity, their roles forgotten or deliberately obscured. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht and the apolitical bureaucrat took root, allowing generations to believe that only a few monsters were responsible for the Holocaust, rather than a vast network of collaborators, enablers, and silent witnesses. Meanwhile, survivors struggled to rebuild lives from ashes. Many found no homes to return to. Polish towns that once thrived with Jewish culture were now empty or hostile. In 1946, in Kielce, Poland, a blood libel rumor sparked a pogrom that killed 42 Jewish survivors, proof that anti-Semitism had survived Hitler. Displaced persons camps across Germany became temporary havens, where orphans learned Hebrew, couples married under makeshift chuppahs, and dreams of Zionism grew urgent. The State of Israel, founded in 1948, was born not only from ancient longing, but from the raw trauma of the Shoah, a nation forged in the conviction that Jews must never again be powerless in the face of annihilation. Back in Germany, denazification faltered under the pressures of the Cold War. Former Nazis were quietly reintegrated into intelligence services, industry, and academia. It would take decades and the relentless work of historians like Raoul Hilberg, whose 1961 book, The Destruction of the European Jews, first mapped the bureaucratic machinery of genocide for the full scope of Wannsee's significance to be understood. Hilberg showed that the Holocaust was not a sudden eruption of violence, but a process: identification, expropriation, concentration, deportation, extermination. Each step required clerks, engineers, railway workers, judges, and mayors, ordinary people doing ordinary jobs in service of an extraordinary evil. The Wannsee Conference itself became a symbol not of the beginning of the Holocaust, but of its transformation into a pan-European project. Before Wannsee, the killing was chaotic, localized, often improvised. After Wannsee, it was systematic, continent-wide, and state-directed. The conference did not decide the final solution. That decision had already been made in Hitler's inner circle by late 1941, but it synchronized it. It turned ambiguity into clarity, hesitation into momentum. It ensured that every ministry, every occupation, authority, every railway directorate knew their role in the machinery of death. And yet, even amid this coordination, contradictions persisted. While Jews were being gassed in Poland, Jewish workers in Berlin factories were temporarily spared because they were deemed essential. In Budapest, in 1944, Adolf Eichmann negotiated with Jewish leaders to exchange lives for trucks, a grotesque bargaining that revealed the regime's blend of ideological fanaticism and opportunistic pragmatism. In Denmark, nearly the entire Jewish population was ferried to safety in Sweden in October 1943, thanks to a spontaneous national rescue effort that embarrassed the Nazis and proved that resistance was possible, even under occupation. These complexities challenge simple narratives. The Holocaust was not monolithic. It unfolded differently in Amsterdam than in Minsk, in Thessaloniki than in Paris. Local collaborators played crucial roles: Ukrainian auxiliaries at Sobibor, Lithuanian battalions in Vilnius, French police rounding up Jews for deportation. But so did local rescuers: Polish nuns hiding children, Dutch students forging documents, Italian generals refusing to hand over Jews in occupied Croatia. Human behavior, even in extremis, remained varied, capable of both profound cruelty and quiet courage. By the time the last death camp was liberated in May 1945, 6 million Jews had been murdered, 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population. Entire lineages were extinguished. Yiddish, once the vibrant tongue of millions, became a language of ghosts. Synagogues stood roofless, Torah scrolls burned, cemeteries plowed under. The cultural loss was as vast as the demographic one. And yet, from this abyss, memory emerged as an act of defiance. Survivors testified. Children bore names of the dead. Communities rebuilt, not as they were, but as living memorials. In the decades that followed, Wannsee became a pilgrimage site not for mourners alone, but for students, diplomats, soldiers. German schoolchildren now tour the villa as part of their civic education. The dining room, where Heydrich outlined the final solution, is preserved exactly as it was, down to the fireplace and the view of the lake. There are no dramatic reenactments, no sensational displays, just documents, photographs, and silence. The power lies in the ordinariness of the setting. A stark reminder that evil does not always announce itself with fanfare. It can wear a suit. It can take minutes. It can happen over coffee. Today, as new forms of authoritarianism rise, as conspiracy theories echo old libels, as refugees are dehumanized in political rhetoric, the lessons of Wannsee feel urgently contemporary. It teaches us that genocide does not begin with gas chambers, it begins with words, with laws that exclude, with media that demonize, with bystanders who look away because it doesn't concern them. The men at Wannsee did not see themselves as murderers, they saw themselves as problem solvers. And that is perhaps the most terrifying truth of all. But Wannsee also teaches resilience, because for every bureaucrat who signed a deportation order, there was a stranger who hid a child. For every train that rolled eastward, there was a voice that whispered, "Not here, not on my watch." The Holocaust was humanity at its worst, but also, in scattered, flickering moments, at its best. And in that tension lies our responsibility, not just to remember the dead, but to protect the living, to recognize the patterns before they harden into policy, to speak when language is twisted to justify cruelty, to understand that civilization is not a given, it is a choice, renewed every day. The villa still stands by the lake. The water is calm, the trees grow tall, and inside, the ghosts of the 20th of January 1942 wait not for vengeance, but for vigilance. In the quiet aftermath of liberation, as Europe tried to stitch itself back together, the world grappled with how to name what had happened. The term Holocaust, from the Greek holocauston, meaning completely burned, entered common usage only in the 1960 seconds, popularized by historians, and later by the 1978 American television miniseries that brought the story into millions of living rooms. Before that, survivors often spoke simply of the destruction, or used the Hebrew word Shoah, which carries no sacrificial connotation, only utter desolation. Naming mattered, because to name is to define, and to define is to assign meaning. Was this a crime against Jews alone, or against humanity itself? The debate shaped memorials, textbooks, and international treaties for generations. At Wannsee, the victims had been reduced to statistics, 11 million to be evacuated. But each number was a person: Leah from Lublin, who taught piano; David from Amsterdam, who repaired watches; Miriam from Salonika, who braided her daughter's hair each morning before school. Their individuality was the first thing the Nazis sought to erase, and it is the first thing memory must restore. That is why in Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust memorial, the Hall of Names rises like a cavern of light over 2.7 million pages of testimony, each bearing a face, a birth date, a hometown. The project continues, because for every name recovered, a fragment of dignity is reclaimed from the void. The Wannsee Protocol itself, just 15 pages of typed minutes, survived only because a single copy was sent to the Foreign Office and filed away, forgotten until American prosecutor Robert Kempner stumbled upon it in 1947. Had it been destroyed, as most Nazi documents were in the final days, we might never have had such clear evidence of the regime's centralized intent. Its survival was accidental, yet it became foundational. It showed that genocide could be planned in daylight, with carbon copies and agenda items. It revealed that the architects of the final solution were not raving ideologues, but men who worried about jurisdictional overlap and pension rights for Jewish civil servants married to Germans. This bureaucratic banality is what philosopher Hannah Arendt captured in her famous phrase, "the banality of evil." Not that evil is ordinary, but that it can be committed by ordinary people who cease to think critically, who substitute duty for conscience. Adolf Eichmann, on trial in Jerusalem in 1961, did not rant about Jewish conspiracies. He spoke of orders, obedience, and the chain of command. He claimed he never killed anyone himself, a technical truth that ignored his role in orchestrating the deaths of millions. The world watched, transfixed, as a man who had once coordinated train schedules for genocide now fidgeted under courtroom lights, insisting he was just a cog. Yet history resists simplicity. Even within the SS, dissent flickered. In 1942, Wilhelm Hertel, an intelligence officer, reported that Heydrich had told him the final solution aimed to kill about 4 million Jews, a figure later revised upward as the net widened. But others, like Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and armaments minister, later claimed ignorance of the death camps, though evidence suggests he knew more than he admitted. The truth lies in the gray zone. Not everyone knew everything, but many knew enough and chose to do nothing. Meanwhile, the machinery of murder continued to evolve. At Auschwitz, Dr. Joseph Mengele conducted grotesque experiments on twins, searching for secrets of heredity that would serve Nazi racial theory. In Berlin, statisticians refined deportation quotas. In Paris, French police compiled lists of Jewish residents with chilling efficiency. Collaboration was not uniform, but it was widespread, enabled by centuries of anti-Semitism, wartime opportunism, and the human tendency to conform. And yet, resistance persisted in unexpected forms. In the Theresienstadt ghetto, artists painted secretly, musicians performed in attics, children wrote poetry that survived in hidden suitcases. In the forests of Belarus, Jewish partisans blew up German supply trains. In Rome, Pope Pius XII's silence remains controversial, but individual priests and nuns sheltered Jews in monasteries and convents. In Bulgaria, public outcry and parliamentary pressure stopped the deportation of 48,000 Jews, an example of how civic courage could alter fate. By 1944, as the Allies closed in, the Nazis accelerated the killings even as their empire crumbled. At Auschwitz, the crematoria ran day and night. In Hungary, Eichmann oversaw the deportation of 437,000 Jews to Auschwitz in just 8 weeks, most murdered within hours of arrival. Yet even then, hope flared. Raoul Wallenberg, a Swedish diplomat, issued protective passports and set up safe houses in Budapest, saving tens of thousands. His fate remains unknown. He disappeared after being detained by Soviet forces in 1945, but his legacy endures as a testament to individual agency in the face of systemic evil. When the camps were liberated, the world saw what words could not convey. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, visiting Ohrdruf, a subcamp of Buchenwald, ordered every American soldier in the area to witness the horror. "We are told that the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for," he wrote. "Now, at least, he will know what he is fighting against." Film crews documented the scenes: piles of bodies, skeletal survivors, warehouses of stolen belongings, so that denial would be impossible. Yet denial came anyway, and persists to this day. In the decades since, Wannsee has become more than a historical event. It is a warning encoded in stone and memory. Germany, once the engine of genocide, now enshrines remembrance in law. Holocaust denial is a criminal offense. Schools mandate visits to memorial sites. The phrase, "never again," is etched into public consciousness, but its meaning is tested anew. With each outbreak of ethnic cleansing, each rise of hate speech, each border closed to the persecuted. The villa at Wannsee, once a symbol of cold calculation, is now a place of education. Guides lead visitors through the rooms, not to shock, but to understand. They explain how a society can slide from discrimination to deportation to destruction, not in a single leap, but through 1,000 small surrenders of principle. They ask students, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up when your neighbor's business was marked with a yellow star? When your colleague was fired for being Jewish? When the trains began to roll? These questions are not academic. They are urgent, because the conditions that enabled Wannsee xenophobia normalized, truth eroded, institutions hollowed out by ideology are not relics of the past. They are patterns that recur in different forms, in different lands. The lesson is not that we are all potential Nazis, but that we are all potential bystanders or resistors. The choice lies in the everyday, in the joke we laugh at, the law we accept, the silence we keep. And so, the story of Wannsee does not end in 1945. It continues in courtrooms where survivors testify at over 90 years old, in classrooms where children read Anne Frank's diary, in parliaments where leaders debate refugee policy, in social media feeds where conspiracy theories spread like digital poison. Memory is not passive. It is an act of will, a refusal to let the dead be forgotten, a commitment to see the human behind the statistic. The lake outside the villa is still there. In summer, families picnic on its shores. Children laugh. Boats drift lazily. It is beautiful, peaceful, a place where evil once sat down to lunch and left no trace but paper. And that is why we must return again and again, not to dwell in horror, but to guard against its return. For the greatest danger is not that we forget the past, but that we think it could never happen again. The echoes of Wannsee reverberate far beyond Europe's borders, shaping global responses to atrocity in ways both profound and imperfect. In 1948, the United Nations adopted the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, a direct response to the Holocaust, drafted in part by Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish lawyer who coined the term genocide to describe the systematic destruction of a people. Lemkin had lost 49 relatives in the Shoah. His life's work was to ensure that such annihilation would never again be dismissed as an internal affair of a sovereign state. Yet, in the decades that followed, the world repeatedly failed to uphold that promise in Cambodia, in Rwanda, in Bosnia, in Darfur. The mechanisms existed, but the will often did not. Wannsee taught us that genocide is preventable, but only if the international community chooses to see it coming and chooses to act. Back in Germany, the reckoning was slow, painful, and incomplete. The 1,960 seconds brought a generational rupture, as young Germans demanded to know what their parents had done or failed to do during the Nazi era. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, 1,963-1,965, marked a turning point. For the first time, Germans prosecuted Germans for crimes committed against Jews, not just for excesses against fellow citizens, but even then, many perpetrators received light sentences and public opinion remained divided. It wasn't until the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds, with films like Holocaust 1979 and the visit of Israeli President Chaim Herzog to West Germany in 1987, that a broader societal confrontation with the past began to take root. The Wannsee Conference itself entered the curriculum not as a footnote, but as a case study in how modern states can weaponize bureaucracy. Historians now emphasize that the Holocaust was not an irrational outburst, but a hyper-rational project enabled by census data, railway logistics, legal decrees, and financial audits. IBM's German subsidiary, Dohomag, provided punch card technology that helped catalog Jews by name, address, and ancestry. Banks processed confiscated assets. Universities expelled Jewish scholars, then erased their contributions from academic records. Every institution lent its legitimacy to the regime's goals. This systemic complicity raises uncomfortable questions about our own age. In an era of digital surveillance, algorithmic sorting, and mass data collection, the tools of exclusion have only grown more sophisticated. When governments compile registries based on religion, ethnicity, or nationality under the guise of security or efficiency, they echo the logic of the Nuremberg Laws. When dehumanizing language becomes normalized in political discourse, it mirrors the propaganda that paved the way for Wannsee. The lesson is not that technology is evil, but that it amplifies human intent, whether for connection or control. And yet, countercurrents of remembrance persist. In 2005, the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe opened in the heart of Berlin, a field of 2,711 concrete stelae, disorienting and somber, designed to evoke absence rather than provide answers. Nearby, an underground information center tells individual stories, ensuring that the memorial is not just an abstract monument, but a place of learning. Similar sites have emerged across the continent. In Warsaw, a museum rises where the ghetto once stood. In Paris, plaques mark the schools from which Jewish children were taken. In Amsterdam, visitors queue for hours to stand in the hidden annex where Anne Frank wrote her diary. These acts of memory are not passive. They are assertions of moral continuity. They say, "We remember not because we are haunted, but because we are responsible." Responsibility does not mean guilt, it means vigilance. It means recognizing that democracy is fragile, that rights are not self-executing, and that silence in the face of hatred is a form of consent. The survivors who returned to Wannsee in later years, men and women who had lost everything, did not come for vengeance. They came to bear witness, to say, "This happened, here, in a room with fine wood paneling and a view of the lake, not in a distant land of monsters, but in the heart of Western civilization. And if it happened there, it can happen anywhere." Today, as authoritarianism resurges, as anti-Semitism climbs to levels not seen since the 1932, as conspiracy theories paint minorities as existential threats, the Wannsee model looms larger than ever. Not because history repeats itself exactly, but because the patterns are recognizable. The scapegoating, the erosion of truth, the incremental stripping of rights, the normalization of cruelty. The conference of the 20th of January 1942 was not the spark, it was the culmination. And its true danger lies not in its uniqueness, but in its replicability. But within that warning lies hope. For if evil can be systematized, so too can resistance. The rescuers of the Holocaust, those honored as righteous among the nations at Yad Vashem, came from every walk of life: farmers, priests, teachers, diplomats. What they shared was not power, but courage. The courage to see a human being where others saw a problem to be solved. Their actions remind us that morality is not a grand gesture, but a daily choice: to speak, to shelter, to refuse. As the last survivors pass from the scene, the burden of memory shifts to new generations, not to carry guilt, but to carry understanding. To know that the path to Wannsee was paved not with screams, but with silence, not with chaos, but with order. And that the antidote is not heroism alone, but ordinary decency, consistently, stubbornly practiced. The villa still stands, the lake still glistens, and the question remains: what will we do when the next list is drawn? In the final years of the 20th century and into the 21st, The story of Wannsee began to transcend national memory and enter the realm of global moral education. Museums from Washington to Cape Town, from Tokyo to Buenos Aires, now include the Holocaust in their narratives of human rights, not as a Jewish tragedy alone, but as a universal warning about the fragility of civilized norms. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, opened in 1993 on the National Mall, deliberately places the Shoah within a broader context. Adjacent exhibits examine genocide in Rwanda, Cambodia, and Bosnia, making clear that Wannsee was not an endpoint, but a precedent. Visitors leave not just with sorrow, but with a charge to recognize the early signs of dehumanization wherever they appear. Digital technology has further transformed remembrance. Projects like the USC Shoah Foundation's Visual History Archive preserve over 55,000 testimonies of survivors and witnesses, searchable by keyword, location, and experience. Artificial intelligence now enables holographic survivors to answer questions in real time, ensuring that even after the last eyewitness is gone, their voices will persist. These innovations are not mere technological feats, they are acts of defiance against forgetting, tools to make memory interactive, personal, and enduring. Yet with accessibility comes new challenges. Online spaces have become battlegrounds for historical truth. Holocaust denial and distortion flourish in echo chambers, where conspiracy theories masquerade as alternative history. Algorithms amplify outrage over nuance, and the very tools that preserve memory can also be weaponized to erase it. In response, educators have shifted from simply teaching facts to cultivating critical thinking, helping students discern credible sources, understand propaganda, and recognize the tactics of historical revisionism. The goal is no longer just to know what happened, but to understand how it was allowed to happen and how to prevent its recurrence. Germany itself has become a model, albeit imperfect, of institutionalized remembrance. The phrase Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past, is not a slogan, but a national project woven into law, education, and public life. Every year, thousands of German students participate in exchange programs with Israel. Civil servants visit concentration camp memorials as part of their training. And on January 27, International Holocaust Remembrance Day flags fly at half-mast, and leaders reaffirm their commitment to never again. But even here, complacency is a threat. The rise of the far-right Alternative for Deutschland, AfD party, with its rhetoric downplaying Nazi crimes and calling for an end to guilt culture, shows that memory must be actively defended, not assumed. Meanwhile, the physical sites of the Holocaust continue to evolve. At Auschwitz, conservators worked tirelessly to preserve barracks, shoes, and suitcases not as relics, but as evidence. The camp receives over 2 million visitors annually, many of them school groups who walk the tracks in silence. At Wannsee, the villa's educational mission has expanded. Workshops now explore contemporary issues like refugee policy, hate speech, and digital ethics, drawing explicit lines from past to present. The message is clear. History is not a closed chapter, but a mirror. And in the Jewish world, memory has taken on spiritual dimensions. Yom HaShoah Holocaust Remembrance Day is observed not only with mourning, but with the lighting of candles, the reading of names, and the singing of Hatikvah, the Israeli national anthem, which became an anthem of survival. In synagogues worldwide, the Kaddish, the mourner's prayer, is recited not just for family, but for the 6 million whose names were lost. This ritual transforms grief into continuity, ensuring that the victims are not reduced to statistics, but remembered as souls. Perhaps the most profound legacy of Wannsee lies in its inversion, where the Nazis sought to erase identity. Survivors and their descendants have made identity an act of resistance. Jewish life, once targeted for annihilation, has re-emerged in Tel Aviv's startups, in New York's cultural institutions, in Berlin's revitalized Jewish schools. The very existence of a thriving Jewish future is a rebuttal to Heydrich's plans. And in that resilience, there is a quiet triumph, not of vengeance, but of endurance. As we approach the centenary of the Nuremberg Laws and the 80th anniversary of Wannsee, the world stands at a crossroads. Will the lessons of the Holocaust become diluted by time, or deepened by renewed commitment? Will never again remain a hollow promise, or become a living principle? The answer depends not on monuments or museums alone, but on the choices of ordinary people in classrooms, courtrooms, newsrooms, and voting booths. For the true measure of remembrance is not how we honor the dead, but how we protect the living. Not how we mourn the past, but how we shape the future. Wannsee teaches us that evil thrives, not in darkness alone, but in the gray zones of indifference, bureaucracy, and silence. And it also teaches us that light can enter through the smallest cracks, through a forged passport, a hidden child, a whispered warning, a single voice saying, "This is wrong." The villa by the lake remains, not as a tomb, but as a classroom. Not as a relic of horror, but as a summons to conscience. And as long as people walk its halls and ask the hard questions, the dead will not have died in vain. Because history does not repeat, but it does instruct. And Wannsee, in all its chilling banality, instructs us this, that civilization is not a fortress, but a flame. And it must be tended every day by everyone.